the NFCC Financial Facts Chat. I want to welcome all of you, our viewers from Facebook, YouTube especially. We appreciate your support and we welcome your feedback. So help us continue providing more of these live episodes by liking and sharing the content, by commenting. You can also, it would be great if you could also follow NFCC if you're not already doing so on Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more of this this content. We have topics every week. Sometimes we do more than one topic a week, and we usually do things morning. Sometimes we do things in the afternoon like we're doing today. And if you miss these, you can always tune in live after. You can tune in on demand after the fact if you missed the live broadcast, and you can still get a chance to watch the videos, to listen to the Q&A. And if you have questions when you're watching on demand, you can always send them in to us, and we try to get you some answers pretty quickly. But before I introduce our special guest today, I want to acknowledge a few things about support for the NFCC when it comes to Wells Fargo. This support helps us change lives by providing financial counseling and education for all the people who struggle with different debt challenges: housing, credit cards, student loans, even small business. So the NFCC is receiving critical support from Wells Fargo and the Wells Fargo Foundation to provide counseling services for renters and for homeowners, which is especially important right now as we're dealing with the economic impacts of COVID. And we'll get into a lot more of that in our Q&A. But Wells is also a generous sponsor of our upcoming NFCC Connect speaker series, which kicks off next week, Wednesday, October 14. And we're going to have opening keynote remarks from CFPB Director Kathy Kraninger. And we've got a ton of speakers lined up and great topics scheduled all the way through November 11th. So for those of you familiar with our conference that takes place every fall, you know that we usually try to cram it in for 3 days. But this year we're doing it over a period of weeks, so it gives you more time to take part in that content. And I just shared the link to that speaker series. So please be sure to take part in that speaker series and participate and check it out as you're able. And at this point, I'll go ahead. I'll introduce our guest. Our guest is back. We're having some connection issues, so I appreciate those of you who are tuning in bearing with me. But I just want to introduce our guest today. He is Rulon Washington. He's the Vice President and East Region Market Leader for Engagement Initiatives and Mortgage Outreach at Wells Fargo. And we welcome you, Rulon, and thank you for being here to discuss the issues that are very present for so many who are homeowners and renters today, and also to talk about all the work that's taking place to find solutions for those who are struggling right now. So welcome to the chat, and thank you for joining us. So welcome to the chat, and thank you for joining us. I just finished your introduction, but I know we're still having some...
Look, hey, it's okay. It's the it's the day we live in nowadays, right?
Are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, yeah, I just noticed we're still having some connection issues, but
look,
welcome to the chat.
It's the pandemic, right? What can you do? Connection.
Yeah.
I mean, we missed the traditional meeting one-on-one, so.
Yeah, again, I apologize for the connection issues. It looks like we're having trouble getting Rulon into the stream today, but we definitely want to keep trying this to see what works. As soon as he pops back in, we'll give it another run. We'll give it another try and see what we can work out here. Here we go. All right, he is back. We're gonna bring him into the stream again. He is back. All right, there he is. Yeah, bear with us, folks. We're again as you
do.
Yeah, it's the pandemic. We're dealing with all kinds of web conferencing challenges.
Wow. Yeah, I'll try my best to have quick fingers to keep jumping in and out if we get cut off. But trust me, it's not going to stop the message.
Great. Well, thanks for being here with us to talk about the issue of housing and the issues that are facing renters. We really appreciate you being here.
No problem. No problem at all.
So you've had a variety of important roles in the housing support sector. Can you talk a little bit about some of the lessons you've learned there that inform your work and approach to dealing with some of the issues that we're experiencing today with COVID?
Well, if you're talking about today, it's technology. But if we're talking about
Yeah.
times before, that's a loaded question, Bruce. It's a really loaded question. So I've been with the company for about 14 years. Actually, this month is my service anniversary. I just meant my wife told me this morning. I didn't even remember. So
Happy anniversary.
yeah, thank you. So I started out with the company supporting Wells Fargo's delinquent auto account. So really focusing on like auto and repossession, and that was my first taste of how finances and behavior and circumstance all meet at life's intersection. So, dealing with customers who are in the midst of getting a car repoed was a really sobering experience, which basically prepared me for my future role, which I would take probably about three and a half years later. And that role was supporting the mortgage servicing side of Wells Fargo. So in 2009, that was a tough time for everybody during the housing crisis. Wells Fargo created a pilot project called Home Preservation Stores, right? So the goal of that was to help customers impacted by the housing crisis. And I became a part of that project. And that's when I understood the importance of housing, right? Really understanding the depth of it all. And so one thing I learned immediately after starting that job was that during a crisis, consumer behavior tends to change really fast, right? Homeowners may be hesitant to open their mail. They may become reluctant to call their mortgage company in fear of bad news or a harmful outcome. We've all been around that, right? So just thinking back to the housing crisis, that was a really deep lesson. Behavior is going to change a lot of things, right? So fast forward to today, and you're noticing some of that same behavior going on now, right? Homeowners may not be aware of forbearance options, or renters may not be, aware of those availabilities for rental assistance, and they may be hesitant to communicate with their landlord. So both renters and homeowners may be unaware of that payment relief that's available across the country, or even on the state or municipal level through the CARES Act. So Bruce, that's my first lesson in housing education, right? Is awareness. Like, how do we make sure people are aware? So after my experience in home preservation, I moved over to a wonderful team that I'm on now. Been a part of this team for the past 7 years or so. And we're currently a part of the Wells Fargo's Housing Affordability Philanthropy team. And so as a group, we're looking at more than just the mortgage piece, right? But how to access quality housing and how that'll impact families as a whole. So thinking more outside of the transaction. But prior to this pandemic, there was a span of about 7 years where my team partnered directly with housing counseling agencies to understand the needs and support the work as they support our customers. It was at this point that I truly understood the value of housing and credit counseling. Really didn't understand that much until that point, right? It's interesting, we're facing some of the same issues we faced during the housing crisis, and it just so happens that the crisis is impacting homeowners and renters simultaneously this time. So I learned another lesson earlier this year at the beginning of COVID-19. I think we all learned some lessons with COVID, right? But as an industry, we have to be able to pivot and adjust to change at a very rapid pace, right? We don't know what's ahead of us. And so one of the ways Wells Fargo has made that pivot is by providing close to $10 million of philanthropic support to housing counseling agencies like NFCC that are working directly with homeowners and renters, right? So that's another feather in our cap. That's how we were able to pivot. I always say Wells Fargo is a large cruise ship with a lot of suites, but sometimes you have to make that pivot in the ocean, right? So we're able to do that. And another way that we're supporting renters is also through a program that I'm thankful that I helped to create. It's a legal assistance program called the Wells Fargo Housing Stability Grant. We provided $5 million to legal assistance organizations. And so I'm really excited about that support for legal assistance because it's the first time Wells Fargo is doing something like that. And in the industry, they're always asking that question, what about renters? And yes, there's rental assistance out there through the CARES Act, but does that truly stop the process of eviction? So as a company, we decided to create this housing stability grant, which provides funding to legal assistance organizations. And that funding solely to provide operational support, right? So those organizations can have the strength to provide that access to free quality civil legal services. And we're able to provide, 15 legal assistance organizations with grants. And so that's a really big pivot for us, right? So doing the research for that grant also taught me one more valuable lesson that I'll share. Resources and representation are key to supporting both renters and homeowners. So that's like I should tape that on my wall because that's
make a sign out of that.
Exactly. Exactly. But great question.
Yeah, and you touched on a couple of things that I wanted to ask about next, but I think going back to the points that you made about the housing crisis and some of the lessons learned early, It's interesting. I hear this from a lot of people, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your remarks. The housing crisis, we learned a lot during that period of time. And it was, I mean, this sounds a little bit morose to say, but it's almost like it was a dry run for some of the things that we needed to know
Right.
and needed to have at the ready now. And it sounds like that's exactly how you approach that in your perspective, by taking those lessons and then applying them to the incredibly unique situation that we're facing with COVID. But there are enough similarities in response mechanisms and the operational side that you can really move some of these initiatives forward and have impact. And I think that thing that you're doing on the legal side for renters is amazing. I mean, talk about something that's critically needed right now. So many struggling renters are dealing with some complex legal issues, and they need help, and often they don't know where to turn, or they don't have the resources to get the kind of help they need. So that's tremendous what you're doing there.
That's correct. Thank you, Bruce.
But so I guess looking now at the situation that we're facing with COVID, all the related shutdowns, they've had dramatic impacts across the country. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific challenges that you see renters facing in particular, and how those challenges differ, as we talked about initially, those lessons that we learned from the housing crisis, how those challenges differ from what we've seen in the past?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the lack of resources and state protections for renters in low-income communities has always been an issue, right? Especially in diverse communities, Black and brown communities. That's always been an issue. The pandemic just shined a bright light on all of the issues around housing stability that we've seen across the areas for decades, right? So before the pandemic, renters facing eviction faced numerous challenges, right? So I wrote down a few statistics. So let me read these off real quick, right? I thought these were really, really cool to understand, right? Renters receive limited legal representation, win or settle their cases 83% of the time, yet in eviction lawsuits nationwide, an estimated 90% of landlords have legal representation, while only 10% of tenants do. So there's a big disparity there. So
that's huge, yeah.
Exactly. So ensuring low-income people have legal representation is a glaring equity gap, and that was before the pandemic, right? So there's a book I would recommend everybody read, right? So there's a book titled Evicted by Matthew Desmond. The book captures the complex lives of landlords and tenants in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it really highlights the issues faced when there are socioeconomic boundaries involved in a renter and a landlord's relationship. And so there's some glaring differences there, and I think that's a really good avenue for people to explore pre-COVID what some of the rental issues were. The glaring change since the pandemic is that anyone can fall victim to the crisis now, right? It's not just about low-income people in certain areas. Legal assistance organizations are seeing more clients that have higher incomes, live in more upscale areas, that are still seeking assistance. So keep in mind that many state and local eviction moratoriums have ended, right? So now you enter the CDC agency moratorium, right? So that newly announced CDC agency order does provide another layer of protections for renters once that moratorium ends on the local level. But there's some concern in the industry on how the CDC moratorium will be applied across the country, right? So the question is, how will states manage the declaration that needs to be signed by a tenant to help them avoid eviction? And on top of that, the moratorium only protects tenants from eviction for non-payment, meaning evictions can take place for any reasons, whether legal or illegal, as long as it's non-payment. So there's a big discrepancy, but to sum it all up, right now, anybody can be impacted versus where you live or what color your skin is.
Yeah, and it's confusing for a lot of people. I think all of these different nuances to the protections and how people are covered in some ways and how people aren't. So that just draws attention to the fact that it's all the more important that people are receiving advice and guidance from those who know their way around some of these challenges, rather than being thrown into these landlord-tenant situations where the landlord is probably much better equipped to protect their own interests.
Right.
The tenant is just hung out to dry, essentially, without representation and without access to the right kind of information. So
yeah, and I would also throw this out there that landlords are impacted now too, because before landlords were in a situation where they had all the control. Now landlords, they may need a forbearance, right? They may need to reach out to their mortgage company to get help. They may not know how to engage with their tenant, right? They may not know that there's rental assistance that's available. And I'm probably going to talk about this a little bit more, but when you think about rental assistance, a lot of municipalities and states that have funds through the CARES Act, they're going to pay the landlord, right? That money's going to the landlord. And so when a landlord does go through an eviction for their tenant, with that summary judgment, once it all ends, that landlord may get 7 to 6 cents on the dollar on a return on their arrearages, right? Some of these rental assistance programs are paying 60 to 70% of someone's rent. So it helps out both parties involved, right? So
Mhm.
that's another avenue with this pandemic is, two parties are involved in this simultaneously. The renter's usually impacted. That's the normal culprit that we see is the
Right.
ultimately the landlord now is facing some really harsh decisions as well too. So it's twofold in the pandemic,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
well, that's a really good segue to our next question, and it's one of the things too that I've been made aware of more frequently, is that a lot of these, we call them mom and pop landlords, these
Right.
property owners that have maybe a few properties here and there, have been impacted significantly, and a lot of people tend to think of landlords as these big rental corporations, these massive, property holding corporations, but there are a lot of mom and pop landlords out there that rely on this rental income as a primary source of income. So just to touch on some of that a little bit and to kind of talk about more about landlords, we recognize that a big part of the response to the housing crisis was engaging stakeholders in developing solutions, including lenders, servicers, investors, regulators. So who are some of the critical stakeholders to engage for developing solutions for renters? And to go back to what we were just talking about, how can landlords and property owners be more a part of the solution?
So that's a really good question, Bruce. So let me touch on renters first. So from a mortgage perspective, there are benefits of the CARES Act that protect homeowners, they protect renters. Ultimately, they're protecting renters through the landlord, right? So that landlord is getting help. You mentioned the mom and pops; they usually have a mortgage there, right? So unfortunately, as I mentioned, there are limited protections in place for that renter during the pandemic. So many organizations have stepped up to address this eviction crisis. There are a few stakeholders that are developing impactful solutions for renters. I'll just name a few. I think about the National Low Income Housing Coalition. They focus on resources for low income communities, which are the most susceptible for eviction. They use their platform to educate through information, education, and they also mobilize around public policy. So they create a realistic change on housing, and they have some really good information on their website. So I would encourage folks to check them out. Another organization, Eviction Lab, that may sound familiar. I mentioned the book Evicted. Matthew Desmond, this is
Right.
actually the organization he created. So the Eviction Lab tracks and captures eviction data in real time. So it's really, really good information. And their principal investigator, who's Matthew Desmond, and the author of that book Evicted, he does an amazing job of taking data and policy and tying them together, right? So people can look and see where the highest numbers of evictions are, what areas have, the moratoriums in place. And so it's really important that that information is shared on a higher level. If you visit their website, you'll see some very cool resources, right? They have an eviction tracking system. They monitor weekly updates around the number of cases per day, leading all the way up to 2 or 3 years ago. And so that's some really, really good information. So if you're looking for data, the Eviction Lab is key, right?
That's like a real-time heat map
It,
of
it,
where
it
the
is. It
problem
is.
areas are.
And you can show that to someone and they can have a better understanding of how evictions are playing the role in housing instability today, right? You don't have to be an expert to understand that there may be close to 1,300 evictions in the last month in Cleveland, Ohio, right? A data point like that, it makes you pause, right? So organizations in Cleveland, it's like, okay, what do we do? Where are the resources? And so it helps you pinpoint where the real solutions could potentially be. So I love that organization.
Yeah, I just shared a link in the comments section, by the way, so
Great,
anyone who
great.
wants to visit that website can go and take a look and check all this out.
Thanks for that, Bruce. So another organization that I really like is the National Housing Law Project, and I have a buddy over there, Seamus Roller, who's the executive director. It's another strong organization, and they're focusing on strengthening and enforcing the rights of tenants through policy work and housing advocacy. So they're really trying to break down, I think you and I talked a little bit about this earlier before we started the chat, is the jargon, right, on a legal perspective. Seamus and his group at the National Housing Law Project, they do a great job of breaking down that policy work and that housing advocacy, making it really palatable to the renter and the landlord. So their executive director and their staff do an amazing job of breaking down legislation, policy, so on and so forth. So they're a really good organization as well too. Their key focus, I would say, is to provide communities and advocates with the tools to navigate rights, right? So there's some very good resources to understand the data and policy side of evictions too, but it's really around understanding the rights, right? So the more the industry understands this stuff, the better we can get to solutions. But think those are some really good options to start with if you really want to probe a little bit more. And I'm going to do a plug here. Because this is an organization that actually a website that some folk from my team found, and it's an organization called legalfaq.org, right? Legalfaq.org. It's fairly new, so it's another resource that I think is really important. It's basically a research search engine for any renter that may be facing a potential eviction and isn't aware of legal representation in their area. You literally type in your state and it gives you all of this information. It's extremely helpful. It provides tips for tenants, links to other services in your community, and also provides insight on any available rental assistance programs, which is key too. So landlords can go there and see if there's rental assistance available to them. So that's legalfaq.org. It's a really good website.
I just added that in the comment section as well. So
Great.
folks who are on Facebook and in YouTube can just go ahead and click the link I just added to check out more about that.
Perfect. Thanks, Bruce. And so landlords can take advantage of that as well too. But if we're just thinking about landlords and property owners, for those landlords who do hold a mortgage, there's the CARES Act, right? So you have a forbearance. So landlords are able to request forbearance on their mortgage. There's a myth out there that mortgage forbearance is only for primary residences, but it's for investment properties too. If you have a mortgage, you can take advantage of forbearance. So for those property management groups or landlords without a mortgage, it's important that they're aware of rental assistance programs that are available. So that legalfaq.org is really important for landlords because, as I mentioned, some of these CARES Act funding from the municipal and state level, they're going to pay the landlord directly. And so that's another resource for a landlord as an alternative to eviction, which is really important to keep people housed, right? So the availability of funds, once it's paid out to a landlord, they're able to keep someone from being homeless. So I think that's a really big benefit. But landlords and renters can take advantage of those resources that I mentioned as well too.
Yeah, those are tremendous resources. And what I always tell people in these situations too, all of our viewers who are looking for help, it's great that these resources are available and they're there for you, so you should use them. But when you don't have financial resources, the biggest commodity you have is communication, and you need to use that to connect with the right kind of help and to plug into all the help that you need to get by. Avoid eviction, to avoid foreclosure. It's not going to come to you and drop in your lap. You have to go and you have to make that first step and reach out and talk to those who are there to help you. And there's tons of help available, just like we just shared, just like Rulon just spoke about. So for anybody seeking help, there are the resources, and there's no shame in reaching out for help right now. Goodness knows. I mean, it's,
Yes.
With billions of people suffering right now, you're in company, and plenty of company. And
Right.
so, these resources are here. You might as well use them while they're available if you're struggling. So making people aware of these is a great service that you're doing, Rulon, and that Wells Fargo is doing. That leads me to my next question, talking about making people aware of the resources that are there to help them, and also assisting people through the different steps that they need to take to overcome some of these challenges. What role do you think housing and credit counselors can play in providing assistance to renters and connecting with these solutions and engaging with the stakeholders?
Yeah. So, look, I firmly believe that housing and credit counseling may be the missing piece of this puzzle as we move deeper and deeper into this pandemic. I've supported that work for years now, close to 6 or 7 years, and I hold organizations such as NFCC in very high regard for some of the work that you do. A housing counselor has to wear many hats, right? They need to be a financial coach, a budget planner, a marriage counselor, a negotiator, sometimes even a therapist, right? So housing counseling is critical in today's climate. Usually the inability to pay rent may be a symptom of a bigger problem, right? So we have to acknowledge that. So providing a client with wraparound services is essential to the critical, stable housing, right? It's critical. So for peers in the counseling industry, I would say that this pandemic has created unconditional and unconventional hardships. Things are feeling different now. It's not the normal low to moderate income family that needs assistance. It's that engineer per se who got laid off from their job due to budget cuts, or that store manager whose company decided to close due to the pandemic, or that that restaurant owner whose restaurant just didn't survive the pandemic. Those are the people now that need the help. And credit counseling and housing counseling is essential right now. So in today's climate, we're seeing these instances more frequently than before, where almost everyone is impacted in some way, whether directly or indirectly by COVID-19. So, as we engage our legal assistance organizations across the country doing some of that work in that housing stability grant that we mentioned, we noticed that the strength of the legal assistance organizations is direct service, right? So legal aid is a good resource, but they're doing that direct service. So they're that last line of defense when a tenant goes to court, when they need to mediate with the landlord to avoid eviction. So it's essential for a renter to understand that, they're on their last line of defense when they're going out to a legal aid organization. As we did some of this work with funding some of these legal aid organizations, a lot of the funding went to creating capacity to find ways to connect wraparound services to clients. So it's critical that housing counseling kind of plays that role anyway. They should be the first line of defense. So it's really important for housing and credit counselings to connect with their clients and their resources. And as I mentioned earlier, that lesson that I learned that I mentioned, it's, resources and representation are key to supporting both renters and homeowners. Most of the time, our housing counseling organizations are the representation. They played that role during the housing crisis while assisting homeowners and speaking on behalf of the servicer, speaking to creditors on behalf of their clients. And, this year is critical for everyone, but we have the ability and the experience to really find true solutions. And so I think the world of housing counseling agencies, and I think there needs to be more of a light shine on the great work that's being done there.
Yeah, and as a former counselor, I have a little bit of a biased perspective here, but but that list you ran through about the roles that a counselor provides.
Gosh, yeah.
Just from firsthand experience, you're right. The marriage counselor and all these other things. But that points out a big piece of this, that no single financial challenge lives in a vacuum. And there are other factors that influence every financial challenge and that it influences as well. So there are, if you look at the role that housing counselors play, not only are they providing some direct assistance in helping you navigate the challenges in front of you, but they're also giving you the tools you need to better understand how to manage these kind of situations and be maybe come through some of these challenges, if they ever come up again in your life, a little bit better and a little bit better protected. Because the other thing that's a concern that I always think of in terms of where people are getting help and how the help is getting to people is that these services, you talked about legal aid and you talked about housing counseling, are competing against some pretty seedy things out there, scammers and fraudsters that are also out there to take advantage of people who are in no position to face further financial loss. So it's important to raise the visibility of the programs that are legitimate and the programs that are providing a lasting, impactful financial help. So all the work that Wells Fargo has done in this area, and you've gone through a lot of detail in your presentation. I mean, I think the positive impact is almost immeasurable because of all the good that these programs are doing and will continue to do as we, this crisis isn't over. So as we continue to deal with the challenges that are ahead of us. So thank you. And thanks to Wells Fargo.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think we're up against the bottom of the hour here, so that's about all of the time that we have. We really squeezed every minute out of this, but Rulon, I appreciate your patience with some of the technical issues, and I appreciate you sticking with us. This was really good information. We had a good amount of engagement here on the live video, and I will say again to those who are watching, if you're watching after the fact and you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the chat. We at the NFCC will try to get answers back to you very promptly. Tune in again next week, and thanks again to our guest, Rulon Washington. We are absolutely going to have you back. So now you're on the list.
All right, I'm gonna hold you to it. I'm gonna hold you to it.
All right. Well, thanks again for being a part of this, and